Chapter 17, Mr. Tucket by Gary Paulsen. The week of idle resting that Mr. Grimes had promised Francis never took place, but it wasn't the mountain man's fault. What happened to ruin the week was the sudden arrival of more company. But this time the company didn't consist of friends of Jason Grimes. They arrived on the third day after all the pelts had been hung to dry. Contrary to what he had thought, Francis didn't sleep even for a day. After 10 hours of solid snoring, he was up gathering wood, and by the second day, he was practically bored stiff.
"Don't fret so much, Mr. Tucket,"
the trapper said, when Francis began grumbling.
"A man would think you wanted to go back to work. Rest up a mite. There'll be plenty to do."
Francis snorted. I wouldn't even mind some more trapping. It's better than just sitting around, getting soft.
"Ah, Mr. Tucket, relax. Trap more beaver, and you just have to sit around for another week. These things take time."
So Francis had dreamed up things to do. He made bullets, when he already had enough to stand off a small army. He took to riding around the meadow along the stream, not going anywhere in particular, just riding. And he was riding on the morning of the third day out along the stream, just angling across it, not paying much attention to what he was doing, when something whistled past his cheek, brushing him lightly, almost like a fly. He reached his hand up absently, and at that instant the horse stepped on a rock and stumbled. The sudden movement saved Francis's life. The second arrow, which would have hit him squarely in the middle of the chest, whirred past and buried itself in the muck of a beaver dam, 10 yards upstream. "Hee-yah!" Francis screamed, and at the same second fired his rifle in the air. He had two purposes in mind for shooting the rifle. First, it would warn Mr. Grimes. Second, it would get the mare running. And run she did. Like a little bomb going off beneath Francis, she was out of the stream and at a full gallop in the space of one breath, while he clung to her back like a flea. She ran straight ahead, and luckily she happened to be pointed toward the camp. But unluckily, she was also pointed toward the Indians, who were hiding in the brush along the stream between Francis and the camp, and she took him right through the middle of them. Francis hadn't seen the Indians, and suddenly he was 10 feet away from all 5 of them. There were 5 crows, painted for war, ready and wanting one thing, to make Francis look like a porcupine. Arrows whistled by him, and Francis felt as though the world had suddenly gone crazy. Painted faces popped up in front of him, screeched, loosed a feather missile, and disappeared. Somebody fired a gun right by his face, and it deafened him. He felt a hand grab at his leg, and he managed to shake it. Another hand came up. He clubbed it down with his empty rifle, and he was free. He was out of the ring of faces and arrows, flying along with the mare. He looked back. He had seen no horses, but he knew that the Indians wouldn't be too far from their mounts. It was nearly 2 miles to camp. 2 long miles. His horse was well fed, and with any kind of a lead, he could probably beat them. He studied the ground ahead. It was smooth, grassy, ideal for running. He looked back again and saw that 2 Indians were mounted and started after him. As he watched, 3 others burst out of a stand of willows near where they jumped Francis. It would be a chase. Francis studied his lead, 100 yards, no more, and he was holding an empty rifle. I have to beat them, he thought. He had a good mount in his Indian pony, but the crows were also riding Indian ponies. It stood to reason that out of 5 ponies, at least one would be as fast or faster than his. He couldn't expect miracles all the time. Sure enough, one of the ponies was as fast as his little mare, but 2 others were faster, and they gained rapidly. Before he'd covered half a mile, they had cut his 100-yard lead in half. Francis leaned forward. "Run! If I ever needed speed, I need it now." She was full out already. She put her ears back and stretched an inch or 2, but it didn't help much. Another half mile, he thought, watching the 2 Indians gaining on him, and they'll be alongside of me. Then what? 40 yards now, and one of the Indians raised his bow and loosed an arrow. Francis, looking back, saw the arrow rise in a slow arc and fall toward him. He felt his stomach tighten as his eyes followed its course. It fell short by 10 yards or so. The Indian fitted another arrow to the bow and aimed. He's getting the range, Francis thought. Only 30 yards separated them now. Francis nudged his pony just as the Indian shot his second arrow. The mare veered to the left, still at a dead run, and the arrow missed. 20 yards now. They can't miss again, he thought. Not at this shortest range. Only 15 yards, and now 2 Indians raised their bows. "No!" Francis cried. "You can't!" Then he heard it, far off, a noise like the sound of muted thunder. A second later he heard something whisper over his head, and the lead Indian fell from his horse. The second Indian veered aside, releasing his arrow at the same time, but missing Francis. The great Hawkins of Jason Grimes had done it again. Francis eased up a bit and looked for the mountain man. It was still almost a quarter of a mile to camp. An impossible range, an impossible shot. Now Francis saw him, a speck that was leaning against a tree by the camp. At this range it was impossible to tell what the mountain man was doing, but in a moment Francis knew. A cloud of smoke jumped out in front of him, and the sound of a shot followed. Francis whirled to watch the Indians. One of the ponies somersaulted, throwing his rider heavily. That still left 3, and those 3 stopped, dismounted, and hid behind available cover. Francis dropped down to a canter. It was safe now, and the mare was blowing pretty hard. Even so, it wasn't but a few moments before he was dismounting at the camp. Mr. Grimes was smiling.
I do declare, Mr. Tucket, you sure pick some mighty funny people to be horse racing with. If you were all that hard up for something to do, I might have raced you myself. You didn't have to go and find a bunch of crows.
Well, you know how it is, Francis answered, returning a smile, though he was shaking inside and felt a little sick to his stomach. I was getting pretty bored, just sitting around all the time. Fellow needs some action now and then.
Used to be that way myself, before I lost my arm. Still, I wish you'd come back and ask me before you do those things.
He pointed at the Indians in the field. One of them had mounted and was heading away at a run. The mountain man shrugged.
No sense doing any more fancy shooting. One of them would be bound to get away.
Where's he going? Francis asked.
For help, Mr. Tucket, and I expect not too far the way he's riding. Well, you said you wanted something to do, some action. Unless I miss my guess before long, you're going to get all the action you ever wanted. Unless...
Unless what?
Unless we run, Mr. Tucket, and stay ahead.
But we can't run, Francis said. There are 2 of them left watching us. They'd know right where we went.
I swear, Mr. Tucket, you're getting smarter every day. So it appears that what we've got to do is get rid of those 2 Indians in the field.
We?
Sure. Are you figuring on doing it all by yourself?
Francis looked out across the meadow. 2 ponies stood grazing almost a mile away, but the Indians weren't in sight. They could be anywhere, everywhere.
How do we do it? Simple, Mr. Tucket. We walk out there until they shoot at us. Then we shoot back.
Francis suddenly remembered that his rifle was empty. He reloaded it quickly.
All right, Mr. Tucket, let's go. We don't have all day.
The mountain man started walking out across the meadow, his rifle draped casually across his shoulder. He looked for all the world as though he was just going for a morning stroll, or perhaps to hunt rabbits. Except these rabbits, Francis thought, hurrying to catch up, aren't like normal rabbits. These rabbits shoot back.